First one I'm going to start off with is Boston in the USA. Different to me, it was this massive cultural difference, particularly compared to Europe. Work and people's goals and drive at work was the most evident thing that I've seen. And maybe it was just my experience, but I really did like that drive. And it was evident in the number of hours that people worked, the number of hours they worked outside of work, the times that people would get up in order to push for their current work or the projects that they're working on. I wouldn't say it's the best thing, and Europe does have a difference compared to that in terms of work-life balance, but I think some form of drive is always good, and that was something good to express. Two was striving for excellence. Being mediocre is something that you cannot be if you're in a competitive job like environment in the US of A. Particularly in Boston, New York, and big states, constantly pushed by your seniors to either innovate or come up with something new or show that you're working hard behind the scenes, and that can cause further competition. In some ways, that is a good thing. You're driven to want to work more, and then it's reflected particularly in the salaries. The cost of living is probably on par with Europe. The salaries are far in advanced, and that American drive and excellence is reflected particularly on your worth. So you will be paid based on what you're bringing to the table, particularly in a number of different jobs in the USA. There's a couple negatives working in the USA, living in the USA, is first thing you got to figure out is healthcare. You got to make sure that your job has healthcare insurance included, and then you have to make sure you read into it. So working and living in Europe, if you work in UK or Geneva, you probably won't realize how extensive the US healthcare private system is, how much it costs if you're not appropriately insured. And different insurance companies insure different levels, and not all doctors provide certain levels of insurance, and therefore you may not be treated based on your insurance at certain hospitals. So you have to really read into the contract that you're being given by these companies who are hiring you from the US and make sure that you have healthcare included. Otherwise, it's going to be very expensive. Healthcare in and of itself is so surprising in the US, particularly with billboards advertising people to purchase various medical drugs with a small caption at the end, like talk to your doctor. It's completely... And coming from the UK, we don't normally see this. We don't normally see pharmaceutical companies advertising drugs on TV, during a Super Bowl advert or something like this to the general public. One other negative aspect to mention of the USA is the skyrocketing cost of living, particularly in major cities. So to rent or to buy a place in Boston or New York is obviously near impossible. And I know it's increased dramatically since I was last there. So that's something else to factor in, and I don't think the UK is to that extent just yet. A positive aspect to mention working in the USA is that people love sports. In Boston was a very sport-driven city, and there was 3 teams that the entire city supports, which is quite different to the UK, in which you have smaller teams in each city, such as London and Manchester. In Boston, it was the Boston Celtics for basketball, which everyone loved and talked about non-stop. It was the Red Sox, which is a baseball team, and it was also the ice hockey team, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of that team. And every conversation almost revolved around it, and even the city, once you walked around, everything was focused on the Boston teams in sports, and it's a very sport-driven city, and that's just my experience, and it might just be Boston itself. Other cities might be different, but it really gets you into the high. All in all, I would definitely recommend USA, but you'd have to factor in a number of things, including healthcare costs, living costs, cost of living, and the other thing to factor in is the number of hours that you're probably working and making sure that you have health insurance. Okay, now coming on to Geneva. I want to talk about my experience of living and working in Geneva, Switzerland. Now, Geneva is a beautiful city with a high quality of life. The city is clean, public transport system is excellent. The work-life balance is also good compared to the USA, definitely. And with a standard working week of roughly 40 hours, and there's plenty of vacation time. The one main benefit of living in Geneva is the amazing wildlife and nature. Maybe not so much wildlife, but the amazing nature. The obvious negative of living and working in Geneva is the massive cost of living. Now, Geneva is probably the most expensive city that I've ever been to. The cost of a sandwich was like 10 quid. It's really shocking compared to other European countries. I think it's mainly due to all the international organizations that are based in Geneva, and Switzerland in general is a high cost country. It's not even just Geneva, it's also Zurich, which I've traveled to as well. So you really have to factor that in. So any job offers have to really factor in the cost of living. Now, if you can get a place associated with your job, including rent or some form of accommodation. That will go a long way, because the cost of renting or accommodation anywhere within Geneva is very high. And Geneva is an amazing place with quality of life, amazing of lakes and mountains, really hospitable people. The language spoken is also English, but French and German, which you can easily pick up while you're there. But the majority of people speak English anyway. Clean air. It's a really nice place to live. I would definitely choose it if I could afford to. However, that's where it all comes down to, whether or not you can afford the high cost of living of Geneva. So in summary, if you can afford it, great. It's an amazing place to live and work. It's incredible, particularly in the summertime. Last one is living and working in the UK, London. So I was born and raised in the United Kingdom. I've worked in London, Oxford, and also Manchester. And obviously I'm going to be biased by saying this, but I'd have to say that the UK, the benefits of living in the UK is a number of things. One is the NHS, which is a national health service, which means that everybody has free point of care access to healthcare as and when needed, and no one is prioritized, mainly just prioritized based on the clinical need. So that's an incredible feat to have, and that's only something you appreciate once you've left the UK and you've gone to the US particularly, and other countries in Europe as well, where you also have some public/insurance balance. The UK has a number of different cities, so that although the cost of living is high in like London, for instance, similar to New York and Boston level, if you travel out to areas outside the main city of London, the cost of living does drop and it's more affordable. It's a vibrant city, lots of opportunities. Transportation system is great, mix of buses, trains, underground, particularly in London. When you compare that to the US transport system, it's like surprising, given that you'd assume that the US would have an amazing transportation system. Everyone in the US drives. It's different to the US in the way that people have a better understanding of, similar to Europe anyway, people have a better understanding of work-life balance, and everyone's driven. It's just to say that the working environment is slightly different. The negative aspect with living and working in the UK is going to be obvious to everyone, I think, is just the weather. It rains a lot, particularly if you're on the northern cities such as Manchester or Liverpool. And summertime and springtime is quite short, so you have to enjoy it as much as possible. Therefore, it means you're less likely to, engage with the nature, climb mountains, go outside, do outdoor activities. And I honestly, in my personal opinion, I think that is one of the main limiting factors of continuing to work and live in the UK. And it's something you have to factor in, particularly if you're an outdoor person. Hopefully that gives you some insight into my experiences. Catch you next time.